Smoke billowed in from the hall, stinging Molly's eyes. She pulled the stack of worn envelopes from her pocket and stared at the word written across the top envelope. Molly. She held the letters close and tears were spilling down her cheeks. The walls around her were consumed with flames. Molly touched the letters to the fire and they caught almost at once. The paper crackled and curled as the flames spread. She raised the burning envelopes in her trembling hands and walked towards the tree. "Goodbye," she said, and she dropped them in the knothole. The letters disappeared into the black abyss. Molly heard a crackling noise as the fire took hold somewhere deep, deep, deep inside the tree. The sound grew louder. Orange light flickered in the hollow darkness, growing brighter and brighter until hot flames burst from the knothole, consuming the tree. She heard a wheezing breath in her ear and turned to see the night gardener in the hall. His pale skin was charred and cracked. His hat was gone, and from his tattered clothes wafted a thin trail of black smoke. He hissed at Molly, his lips pulled back in a hateful rictus. She was trapped inside the room, flames on every side, and she inched back from the man, and the night gardener lunged at her, and snap! He howled as his foot broke off from his leg. He clung to the doorway, still staring at her, his eyes smoldering embers of rage. Smoke now billowed out from his clothes, his mouth, his every pore. He pulled himself upright and took another step, and when he did, snap! He fell as his other leg broke off at the knee, turning to ash. He hissed, dragging his body towards her closer and closer. He reached out a trembling hand and snap! His fingers crumbled into fine dust, peppering the floor, and with a final wheezing sound, the gardener collapsed into a pile of ashes. Molly clutched her hand to her racing heart, staring at the remains of the night gardener. They had fought the monster, and they had won. It took Molly a moment to realize that the house was coming down around her too. She leapt back as part of the ceiling fell through in showers of sparks. She coughed, covering her face, and ran to the shattered window. She hoisted herself up on the frame and clambered onto the roof. Outside, the flames were even wilder. They roared like an ocean in her ears. She looked out over the eaves. The ground below seemed to twist and waffle in the blistering heat. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she could hear Bertrand shouting her name. And more distant still, she thought she could hear her parents. Through the quivering heat, she saw Master Windsor dragging his wife's mattress across the lawn, feathers trailing behind him. He brought it just below the house, just below Molly's feet. She took aim and jumped. Molly hit the mattress with a hard crash, and she rolled onto the grass, clutching her ankle, which felt sprained. A faint voice sounded in her ear. She opened her eyes to see Bertrand kneeling over her. He took her by the shoulders and pulled her upright. Master Windsor dragged her across the lawn, shouting something that sounded like, "The house! The house!" Suddenly, she heard a tremendous ripping sound, and she looked back to see the tree and the house collapsing in a giant explosion of flames. Molly stared at the mountain of fire, tears filling her eyes. "It's over," she said, her voice hoarse. Master Windsor held her shoulders. "It's over! It's over!" They held each other, hugging with everything in them. Already the flames had begun to die down, the roar replaced by a low, crackling murmur. And it was above this sound that Molly heard a new voice. "Papa! Molly! Hurry! Hurry!" Molly looked towards the road, and Penny was running towards them, waving her arms. Molly clung to Master Windsor, both rushing to meet the girl. "What is it?" Bertrand said. "It's your brother." Penny stepped to one side, and beyond her, Molly saw a heavy figure moving towards them. Alistair, his face dripping, his clothes dripping. All of him was dripping, and in his arms he clutched tight to Kip. Kip! Molly let go of Master Windsor and stumbled towards them. Alistair fell to his knees and lay Kip's body on the ground. I'm so sorry, he said, gasping. He jumped in the river. He saved us. Molly stared at her brother, who was limp and unmoving. His mouth was open, but Molly could hear no breath. A cry crept up through her chest and came out as a whimper. No, she said. No, 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 not Kip, not him, please, not him. She took his dripping body and she pulled him to her chest. You cannot do this, she whispered, a desperate, tuneless, keen. You cannot die, not you, Kip, not you. And Molly could sense people standing around her, but she couldn't see them. She didn't care. All she cared about was Kip. She buried her face in his wet hair and closed her eyes. She tried to find words, something she could say, something to bring him back. And in the darkness, words began to come to her. There once was. Molly swallowed and she spoke the words aloud. There once was a little boy named Kip. She swallowed again, forcing back tears. He was a very special little boy like none other. He had red hair like his father and green eyes like his mother and a fighting spirit like the devil himself. But most of all, he had a sister who loved him more than anything in the whole world. She pressed her lips together. But one day, that sister made a mistake, and she didn't care for him like he needed, like he deserved, and she didn't tell him the truth. She closed her eyes, unable to go on. I'm sorry, she whispered into his ear and then released him. I'm so sorry. Kip lay motionless. His face lit bright against the flames. His body shuddered. Suddenly he coughed, his head lurching forward, gulping for air, and water spewed from his mouth, spilling over his chin and his neck. Molly leapt back, startled. Kip! She hunched over him, afraid to touch him, afraid that maybe what she was seeing might not be real. Kip gasped, shivering, blinking into the firelight. He swallowed, catching his breath. What in the world? What? His eyes met Molly, and a faint smile crept across his lips. What happens next? The flames died down just before dawn. Where the house and the tree had once stood, there was now only a mountain of black ashes that smoldered gently in the dewy light of early morning. Already the life of the valley had begun to encroach upon the long decaying island, and all around her, woo, a bug. All around her, Molly could hear birds and insects chirping and buzzing. The fire had been bright enough to attract attention from the village, and with the morning light came a few brave locals who marveled at what they saw. Even without knowing the truth about the tree, it was plain to anyone who set foot in this place that the Sourwoods were cursed no more. Word spread quickly within Cellar Hollow, and soon men and women were appearing on the long-neglected road, to see the burned remains, perhaps, but also to leave baskets of food and blankets and clothes for the Windsors. The gifts were welcome, for the great fire had consumed every last piece of the Windsors' former lives. Everything, that is, but their lives. And for that, they were all of them grateful. Molly walked along the dew-kissed lawn, enjoying the warm charcoal air, the smell of new beginnings. She smiled, watching Penny and Alistair play among the hills. Look, Alistair shouted, pointing at what might have been a grasshopper or a butterfly. The fairy's getting away. I've got it, I've got it, I've got it, Penny shrieked, hands swiping in the air. Molly knew that Alistair was too old to chase insects, let alone fairies. He was making believe for his sister's benefit, and it was working. Penny leapt between hills with an almost manic glee, her cheeks flushed with color. Some might have thought it disrespectful for children to play among the dead, but Molly knew differently. She knew that among those hills lay Penny and Alistair's own grandparents. Molly could almost picture them resting underground, listening happily as the children of their child laughed and ran overhead. Constance approached Molly's side. The woman still looked thin from her thick sickness, but she was standing on her own. "Listen to them play," she said, her voice touched with awe. "It's like music." She looked at Molly, her eyes creased as she smiled. "We have you to thank for that." Molly shifted her feet. "I'm just the help, Mum." Constance laughed, the first real laugh Molly had heard from her in all their time together. She took a deep breath, hungry breath, surveying the world around her. Things are going to be different this time. Better. "I'm glad to hear it," Molly said. "I suppose you're moving back to town?" The woman shook her head. "We're staying here. Some people from the village have offered to let us stay with them until we can rebuild a home. Bertrand had a bit of insurance on the house. It won't be much money, but it will be enough." She turned to Molly. "We might even have room for a few more. Not as servants, you understand. As family." She took Molly's hand, and Molly was surprised by the warmth coursing through the woman's fingers. Molly felt tears spring to her eyes. "Mom, I do not know what to say." A part of her wanted to say yes, to live forever in this new place, but she knew it wouldn't be right. The Windsors needed time to rebuild themselves, time to be a family. And some things, Molly knew, had to be done alone. "It's kind of you, Mum, it really is. But Kip and me belong somewhere else, and it's my job to find that place." The woman smiled, and Molly could see that she understood. "Look who I found!" called a voice from the trees, and Molly turned to see Master Windsor emerge from the woods, Galileo in tow. The horse, who had run off in the fire, was covered in brambles and burrs and specks of mud. Master Windsor caught up to them, a little out of breath but smiling all the same. "I found him in the woods by the riverbed. He was munching on these." He drew a bouquet of flowers from behind his back and offered them to his wife. They were not magic glowing night flowers, but plain spring wildflowers, and they were lovely. Constance took the bouquet, pressing it to her nose. "Oh, Bertrand." She clutched them to her chest as if these flowers were more precious than all the diamonds in the world. Molly looked between them and started to feel as if she maybe shouldn't be there. And she was right. No sooner had she led Galileo away than Master Windsor pulled his wife close and kissed her right there in broad daylight. Molly walked the horse to her brother, who was standing at the remains of the house. Steam rose from the warm embers as they crackled in the early light. "It's almost beautiful," Molly said, standing behind him. Kip nodded but did not move. "I keep thinking about all of it. About the tree, these graves, the gardener. He cannot hurt us." I know, it's just..." Kip shook his head. "He was once a regular gardener like me. The flowers in the woods, he planted them, cared for them. Then the tree came along and he cared for that too. What was his crime? Making a wish? Wanting something that couldn't be?" Kip blinked his eyes. "That's no different than me. So, why did I deserve to live?" Molly put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll never know. And maybe that's best. It's a bad tale that has all